Welcome to ShockOrama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today we're looking at an early Spanish horror thriller called The House That Screamed, or as it was originally called in Spain, La Residencia. Now, I'm going to need to do things a little bit differently for this video, because unlike other films that I've covered for this channel, this movie was both culturally and politically significant when it came out. La Residencia was released in 1969, when Spain was still under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, whose censorship policies had widespread effects over the entire Spanish film industry. In order to appreciate just how impressive this film is, I'm going to need to provide a little bit of background, just for those viewers who, like myself, before I started researching this video, may know little to nothing about Francoist Spain or the film's director, Narciso Ibanez Serrador. I apologize if you weren't expecting to get a political lecture when you clicked on this video, but it's important to remember that art is not made in a vacuum. And more often than not, it is a response to the socio-political environment in which it was made. Francisco Franco first began taking control of Spain in 1936 after the Spanish Civil War. This takeover unfortunately involved mass incarcerations and executions of anyone that Franco considered anti-Spanish. During World War II, the Francoist government had strong ties to Axis powers in Germany and Italy. In 1947, Franco was established by a referendum as the sole regent of Spain for life, with total authority over choosing his successor. Throughout Franco's rule, the government was heavily pro-monarchist and pro-authoritarian, which is important to keep in mind when analyzing the themes in The House That Screamed, which hopefully you haven't forgotten is the main point of this video. Now, let's talk about the man who wrote and directed the movie, Narciso Ibanez Serrador. Serrador was born in Uruguay in 1935 to two Latin American actors who were not afraid to pull strings here and there to jumpstart their son's career. At the age of 8, Serrador voiced Thumper in the Spanish language dub of Disney's Bambi. Pretty strong start to a career, I must say. When his parents separated, Serrador moved with his mother to Spain, where he was unfortunately forced into a life of solitude due to a disease, hemorrhagic purpura, which prevented him from physically exerting himself by playing with other kids his age, and his mother's acting career, which caused her to be frequently away from home while she was on tour with various theater companies. With an excess of solitude and little else he was allowed to do, Serrador began reading and watching movies, quickly developing a love for the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Ray Bradbury, and Alfred Hitchcock, the last of these being the driving inspiration behind much of his career in film and television. After returning to Argentina in the 1950s, his father helped him get work in the Argentine film industry as a scriptwriter, and there he wrote his first horror series, Obras Maestras de Terror, aka Masterpieces of Horror, which aired from 1960 to 1962. In 1963, Serrador returned to Spain, where he began working at what was at the time the country's only television network, TVE. Here he gained fame for writing and directing the series Historias para no dormir, aka Tales to Keep You Awake, a Twilight Zone-esque series featuring a new self-contained horror or thriller story every episode. The series is remembered fondly to this day, and I even have a Blu-ray edition of it released by Severin Films in 2022. This was also Serrador's first major project where he had to contend with Francoist censorship, leaving him extremely limited in what he could get away with showing on screen. Thankfully, Serrador showed off his knack for building suspense and instilling horror without having to rely on gory special effects. His next project would challenge Francoist censors much more directly. In 1967, Serrador wrote and directed a TV special which was originally intended to be titled Historia de la Censura, or History of Censorship. It consisted of a series of comedic sketches which tracked the history of eroticism all the way from Adam and Eve up to the 20th century, with a framing device of the president of the Women's League Against Frivolity, who periodically praises any and all attempts to censor even the barest glimpse of immodesty. As you probably could have guessed, the real-life censors were having none of it. They immediately demanded that the title be changed to Historia de la Frivolidad, or History of Frivolity, and effectively banned it from airing on TV. However, the producers managed to air it anyway on the sly by having it play at midnight after broadcasting was supposed to have ended for the day. And that brings us to the release of Narciso Ibanez Serrador's first feature film in 1969, La Residencia. What had originally been conceptualized as an episode of Tales to Keep You Awake was instead repurposed into a feature film due to Serrador's popularity and influence. It was given a budget of 50 million Spanish pesetas, which, if the inflation calculator I found is correct, is the equivalent of roughly 8,893,000 euros or 9,800,000 US dollars today. Not a massive budget, especially by today's standards, but at the time it was an unusually high budget for a Spanish film. Set at a school for wayward girls sometime around the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century, La Residencia, or the finishing school, follows the teenage students of the school and their headmistress, Madame Fourneau, who rules with an iron fist. However, as the movie continues, we begin to see the cracks in the system, and you get the sense that the daily routines of the school have evolved into some sort of twisted monster that even the headmistress can no longer control. Since this movie was intended to be released internationally, it was filmed according to standard practices of many European films of the time period, meaning that the actors all spoke their own languages on set and then were dubbed over into various other languages in post. As a result, there's not really any original language for the film, so don't worry about missing any subtleties of dialogue if you choose not to watch the film in Spanish. Unfortunately, that does mean that there are occasional moments where the dialogue doesn't exactly match the actors' lip movements. Though compared to other films I've watched, it's not as bad in this one. Lastly, before we get into the movie proper, I'd like to address the different titles the movie is known by. La Residencia is the original Spanish title the film was released under in 1969, and The Finishing School is just the English translation of that title. In 1971, the film was released to American audiences as The House That Screamed. Along with the change in title, the American version also cut roughly 5 minutes from the original film. However, most of this is inconsequential and just served to tighten up the pacing in a couple scenes. However, I do feel that the original uncut version is superior because this movie lives in its pacing and atmosphere, and I find that the uncut version does a better job of immersing the viewer in that feeling of slow burn dread that Serrador so painstakingly crafted. If you're watching the uncut version, then the movie opens with a long shot of a horse-drawn carriage arriving at some kind of inn. The passengers are a young woman named Teresa and her guardian, an older man of some distinction and class. They quickly hire another carriage which takes them to our titular finishing school, a rather imposing fortress of a building complete with high outer walls and a large wrought iron gate, secured with a heavy chain and padlock. The groundskeeper welcomes them in and accompanies them to the front door of the school, but then jumps back in the carriage and accompanies the driver to the main gate, where he makes sure to lock it behind him as he leaves. Not quite what I'd call a warm welcome. Throughout this scene, we're also treated to the beautifully uncanny main theme for the movie, composed and conducted by Walter de los Rios, who had previously done music for several episodes of Tales to Keep You Awake, and would go on to compose music for Serrador's next film, 1976's Who Can Kill a Child. Inside the school, we see the headmistress, Madame Fourneau, is teaching a dictation class to her students. As she recites a lecture about Moliere's writing prowess and creating his characters, she notices that one student is picking at her fingernails instead of writing. This is Catalina, and she defiantly announces that she does not want to write anything today. Catalina has developed a bit of a revolutionary streak, having already been punished by being sent to solitary confinement for previous infractions. Madame Fourneau has another student, Irene, lead Catalina to the solitary chamber while she continues the class. Madame Fourneau was played by Lily Palmer, a fairly popular German actress who, at this point in her career, was already somewhat of a film star. Mary Maud, who played Irene, remembered in a 2012 interview being somewhat starstruck when Lily Palmer offered her a ride home from set one night, and that apparently the older actress revealed to her in the car that her secret to maintaining her slim figure was to eat 2 pieces of chocolate per day. The more you know. As the 2 students leave the room, Mademoiselle Dupré, the other teacher at the school, enters the classroom to tell the headmistress about the 2 newcomers. Madame Fourneau goes out to meet them, but not before Catalina can get a final word in from the stairwell.
Go to hell.
In the headmistress's office, the man introduces himself as a friend of Teresa's mother and explains that he's here to enroll Teresa in the school. Madame Fourneau is all smiles as she leads them on a tour of the school, but Teresa can't shake the feeling that she's being watched. Seeing the different areas in the school, particularly the dance and music studio, I can really see the influence this movie had on future giallo films, particularly Suspiria and Phenomena, both directed in the late 70s and early 80s by Dario Argento. I get a certain sense of lost beauty as I look at the moldy, shattered mirrors and fading wallpaper. It could perhaps be interpreted as a subtextual clue towards the old forgotten promise of the school, and in a wider political sense, the exhaustion the Spanish people felt towards the authoritarian policies of Francisco Franco. But one thing that was definitely not fading was Cristina Galbo's career, who plays Teresa. After The House That Screamed, she would appear in several giallo films like The Killer Must Kill Again and What Have You Done to Solange? And then in 1974, she would appear in one of my favorite European zombie flicks, Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, aka The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue. The headmistress sends Teresa into the dining room with a maid to eat something while she leads her guardian into an office room so they can finish their business in private. We get a bit of background on Teresa here, with the man delicately avoiding saying anything directly about the mother's background. We get the sense that Teresa doesn't have a father and the mother doesn't have very much money, but still wanted Teresa to get a good education. The man reveals he'd been recommended this school specifically because of how discreet they are in regards to the parents of their students. Madame Fourneau confirms that most of the students have had less than stellar lives up until now, and the school specializes in setting difficult students on the right path through the headmistress's iron grip. During this, Teresa has been having trouble enjoying her tea and biscuits, since there's a lot more cockroaches than she'd been expecting. I guess those high outer walls also keep out the health inspector. The maid tells her that she'd better finish eating though, because she won't be getting much food from now on. This transitions seamlessly into Teresa's first proper dinner at the school, with one poor girl reciting what appears to be a book on Greek mythology while everyone else eats. Here, Teresa makes a good first impression with some of her new classmates by sharing some of the extra biscuits that she'd saved from earlier. However, she also catches the attention of Irene, who stares at her from across the room. As the girls all get ready for bed, Madame Fourneau calls Irene and two other girls to come with her. As soon as they're gone, everyone crowds around Teresa, asking her name and where she's from, and then they all go absolutely crazy over all the clothes she's brought with her, including some very scandalous-looking corsets that apparently belong to her mother. Teresa very willingly parts with the corsets and gets filled in on the latest gossip. Apparently, 3 other girls have already escaped from the school. Since Teresa thinks her mother won't force her to stay, the other girls tell her she probably won't be here much longer. They tell her to ask Catalina about what it's like at the school. That is, once Catalina gets released from solitary confinement. Speaking of, Madame Fourneau and her retinue of loyal students have arrived at Catalina's cell. When Catalina refuses to apologize for her behavior earlier that day in class, Madame Fourneau has 2 of the girls hold her down while she hands a whip to Irene. The shots of Catalina's torture are interspersed fairly artistically, I'd say, with shots of the other girls saying their evening prayers before going to bed. There are also some homoerotic undertones to the whipping, with Irene seeming to take pleasure from the sadistic act that goes beyond merely wanting to follow Madame Fourneau's orders. Madame Fourneau herself looks on impassively as Catalina screams in pain, but there is another scene later on in the movie that seems to heavily imply that the headmistress is a closeted lesbian. I'm gonna stop myself here though, because for what should be obvious reasons, I feel ill-equipped to do a real deep dive into the socio-political ramifications of this portrayal of homosexuality. After the beating is finished, Madame Fourneau gives Catalina one of those classic "you forced me to do this" speeches before giving her a kiss goodnight. And now we meet Madame Fourneau's son, Louis, played by the English actor John Mulder Brown. In an interview, John Mulder Brown described this role as coming at that awkward time in his career when he was transitioning out of being a child actor and into a young adult actor, being around 15 years old when he filmed the movie. His character, Louis, has grown up in an isolated environment thanks to his insanely overprotective mother. She insists to him throughout the movie that he is too sickly to be going outside, even though we never actually see any evidence of physical afflictions. We do see him spying on the girls though, which his mother, Madame Fourneau, is not happy about. She tells him to stay away from all the girls at the school, saying that they're not good enough for him, and he needs to find a woman more like her. Well, that certainly won't have any kind of negative consequences. Oedipus famously had a great life and no regrets. The next morning, Teresa and another girl, Susanna, are assigned to make all the beds together while the others begin classes. During these few moments alone, Susanna is able to tell Teresa about what kind of things the girls do for fun around here. There's a local woodcutter who comes by to restock the woodshed every 3 weeks, and the students have apparently concocted an entire system of taking turns to hook up with him there when he visits. Though Teresa has never had a boyfriend, evidently the lack of boys at the school has driven some of the other girls crazy. We also learn that apparently Isabelle, one of the youngest students, is in love with Madame Fourneau's son, and the two of them have been secretly sneaking off to meet with each other for a while now. Teresa settles into the daily routines at the school, taking classes in dancing, cooking, and gardening, until one day another student comes to tell her that Madame Fourneau wishes to see her. However, when Teresa enters the room, it isn't the headmistress, but Irene who greets her. Irene finally reveals to Teresa, and us the audience, what her exact role at the school is. As well as being Madame Fourneau's second-in-command, Irene also organizes the secret underbelly of the school. She's the one in charge of letting each girl get her turn with the local woodcutter, as well as bestowing other favors on girls if they prove deserving. However, she can just as easily make life hell for students she doesn't like, as we've already seen with poor Catalina. Mary Maud's performance as Irene in this scene, as well as the rest of the movie, is probably my favorite. As menacing and dangerous as Irene is, she still has this element of being a teenager that shows itself every now and then, which makes her character so much more compelling to me and makes for an absolutely fantastic third act of the film. Later that night, Isabelle finds a pair of keys and a note under her pillow, while all the other girls go about their nightly rituals before bed. She quickly brings them into a bathroom stall and reads the note, which is from Louis. In it, he explains that one of the keys is for the dormitory door, the other is for the front door of the building, and he wants to meet her in the greenhouse that night at 11 o'clock. After the lights are put out and everyone else has gone to bed, we see Isabelle quietly sneak out of bed and down the hallway. She makes it to the greenhouse and calls out for Louis, but he isn't there. As she steps further in, a shadowy figure appears behind her, and then covers her mouth as they repeatedly stab her in the chest and stomach. This is the first death of the movie, and while it is 42 minutes in if you're watching the original cut, it is so worth the wait. The brutality of seeing the knife going into her and seeing her spurting blood through the attacker's fingers is scored by the main theme from the soundtrack, only this time it's altered to be slower, more delicate, more tragic. It emphasizes the emotional weight of the brutal murder of this 15-year-old girl and how her death will go virtually unnoticed by those in power at the school. This scene is also allegedly the first time a Spanish film was allowed to explicitly show someone getting stabbed to death. Just another item to add to the list of all the ways that this film is historically relevant. The next morning, Catalina is released and brought back to the dormitory. When she gets there, Madame Fourneau is yelling at the other girls because of Isabelle's disappearance, assuming that she simply ran away last night. She promises them that anyone found to have helped Isabelle escape, or who may be planning to run away themselves, will be severely punished. As she leaves, she tells the other teacher, Mademoiselle Dupré, to have all the locks changed and to hire a carpenter to nail down all the windows. Mademoiselle Dupré asks Madame Fourneau if she doesn't think that Irene, the only other person to have a key to the dormitory, may have helped Isabelle escape. But Madame Fourneau doesn't doubt Irene's loyalty for a second.
They want to escape, they will. This is a boarding school, not a prison.
If it isn't one, we'll make it one.
The girls all go to take showers, supervised by Madame Fourneau today, because Mademoiselle Dupré has of course gone to the town to find a carpenter and to ask for any info about Isabelle. There's an interesting story about how Narciso Ibanez Serrador had to work around the Spanish censors to get this scene in the movie. Basically, the plan had always been to show the girls showering wearing these simple white robes that we see in the final film. But Serrador knew that whatever he asked for this scene, the censors would push against him. So in the first draft of the script that he sent to the censors, he had all of the girls showering completely naked, knowing that the censors would object, and then he could offer this clothed version as a correction. It's stories like this that always seem so silly to me, especially knowing how over-the-top later films in the 70s and 80s would get with nudity. Many of these same films taking direct inspiration from The House That Screamed. While the girls are showering, we see Louis sneak into the boiler room and climb into a kind of crawl space that the water pipes go go through, where there's a peephole that he can use to spy on the girls. But Louis may not be the only one staring inappropriately at these young women. As Madame Fourneau walks past the shower stalls, her gaze falls upon Catalina, who has fully removed her robe. When the headmistress asks Catalina what she's doing, the girl responds saying that she wants to properly wash her back today, and Madame Fourneau should know why. The camera pans and we see the multitude of scars on Catalina's back, which Madame Fourneau certainly cannot argue with. But as the two of them lock eyes, we hear, seemingly from Madame Fourneau's point of view, the sound of feminine moaning and heavy breathing as she locks eyes with the naked girl in front of her. And Madame Fourneau seems to be carefully controlling her face so as not to betray a look of horror, disgust, and lust, which the scene seems to be heavily implying that she is feeling. The moment is fascinating to me and I think is central to the themes of the movie. Madame Fourneau, for all the evil and violent acts that she commits throughout the film, is herself a victim of the very system she created, repressed by her own internalized homophobia, which has no doubt evolved over the years and molded her into the monstrous person that we see now. Meanwhile, Louis, who has been peeping on everyone this whole time, gets locked in the crawl space when the groundskeeper comes back in to check on the boiler and closes the gate that he notices sitting open. Teresa is the last of the girls to leave the shower and dry off, and Louis calls out to her in a stage whisper. But we never see what happens next or how Louis gets rescued, because the scene immediately transitions into Irene once again summoning Teresa into the dormitory to interrogate her. She accuses Teresa of spending a suspicious amount of time in the boiler room over the past few weeks, and says she knows that Teresa's been going there to secretly meet with Louis. If Teresa doesn't meet them in the dining room later that day, Irene threatens to tell Madame Fourneau about her illicit relationship with her son. And now we finally meet Henry, the local woodcutter who has become extremely popular with the girls at the school. He arrives to restock the woodshed as the girls are in a needlework class taught by Madame Fourneau, and Irene makes an excuse for Susanna to leave the class early, since, as we previously learned, this time it's her turn to hook up with Henry. Now, this may come as a surprise to hear, but I think the way this scene is written and shot is absolutely brilliant. It's the kind of scene that pops up quite frequently in horrors and thrillers of the era, an attractive young woman getting down and dirty with a guy. But where other movies would have taken the opportunity to titillate the audience with plenty of lingering shots of bare skin, Serrador instead chooses to focus the camera's lens on the girls still sitting in class, knowing what their classmate is getting up to in the woodshed. Shots of threading needles, wrapping yarn, close-ups of mouths, all increase in pace and intensity as we hear the sounds of Susanna's moaning and breathing. And the score would more suggest a thrilling chase scene rather than an erotic moment. Once again, Serrador has brought the theme of the school's sexual repression to the forefront, as what would normally be portrayed as a scene of playful libido, of a young woman giggling at getting away with a naughty act, has instead been contorted into a scene of violent, carnal desperation. Serrador knew it would be more effective for this movie to shift the camera's focus away from Susanna's pleasure and instead show the other girls' much more interesting reaction of barely contained anger and frustration at not being able to receive that same satisfaction. Louis, through all of this, has been entertaining himself by doing things like torturing and killing ants. Because, as I'm sure we've all realized by now, his mother has been accidentally raising him to become a little psychopath. She chastises him when he comes back inside because he's too frail to be spending time outdoors, and then reveals that she knows that he's been meeting with one of the girls, though she doesn't know which one. She again tells him to stay away from her students, and that someday he will find a woman like her to properly take care of him, and then she kisses him on the lips, which even the camera seems to think is pretty messed up based off of the crazy psychedelic color effects that play after the kiss. Teresa meets with one of Irene's underlings in the dining room right on time, and she gets led downstairs into a dark area of the basement that I get the feeling even the teachers and maids never go to. Inside, she finds another one of Irene's underlings putting her clothes back on, and Irene herself sitting in her secret boudoir. All around her are portraits of nude women, which it's implied Irene made herself, most likely using the other girls as her models. Irene doesn't wait to start tormenting Teresa, first asking painfully pointed pointed questions about the identity of her father, who Teresa had been led to believe was dead. This very quickly evolves into accusations that Teresa's mother, supposedly just a cabaret singer, is actually a prostitute. This fact was implied earlier by the way that Teresa's guardian had spoken about her mother, and by Teresa's general caginess about anything about her mother earlier in the film. The girls eventually force Teresa to wear a red corset and sing cabaret songs like her mother does, which only ends when the dinner bell is heard ringing upstairs. The scene is truly difficult to watch, thanks to the incredible performances by Mary Maude and Christina Galbo. Mary Maude especially is an absolute powerhouse in this movie. Late that night, Irene wakes up to see Teresa tying up her clothes in a bedsheet and climbing out the window. Irene quietly puts a robe on and heads downstairs, then goes outside and waits by the front gate, evidently planning on confronting Teresa once she gets there. Teresa climbs back into the building through a different window and then goes and knocks on Louis's door. So I guess these two have been meeting up. I just wish we could have seen any of their relationship. Earlier I thought that Irene was just lying about their meetups as some sort of power play over Teresa. Louis is upset that Teresa is running away and claims that she's the only friend he's ever had. Gee, I sure would have loved to see any of that. Also, that should sound pretty suspicious considering what we've previously seen of his relationship with that girl Isabel before she got murdered in the greenhouse. Louis goes as far as to break his piggy bank open to give Teresa some money for once she's out. He also advises her to try climbing the main gate, since the gardener specifically cut down all the creepers along the walls to prevent girls from climbing them. After a quick kiss on the cheek, they part ways and Teresa goes downstairs to find a way out of the building. Louis had also warned her that all of the doors would be double locked, so instead of trying the door, Teresa goes to try and open one of the windows on the ground floor instead, using matches to examine the windowsill in the dark. The windows have of course all been nailed shut as per Madame Fourneau's orders after Isabel's disappearance. So Teresa grabs a knife to try and pry the window open. Just as she gets it open, someone comes up behind her and slits her throat in a surprisingly graphic shot for the time period. This was also certainly shocking to audiences at the time, as it was to me the first time I watched the movie, since up until this point, Teresa had been set up as a sort of main character for us to follow throughout the film. Though the common tropes of the slasher film had not yet been established in 1969, it would be fair up until this point to call Teresa a sort of prototypical final girl. Though, of course, with her dead now and 25 minutes left in the movie, she's definitely not the final anything. Irene has been waiting this whole time, watching the school building from behind a tree by the front gate, and she's been getting increasingly puzzled the longer Teresa takes to get out. When it starts raining, she finally gives up and heads back inside. But her puzzlement only increases and turns into real concern when she finds Teresa's makeshift sack with all of her clothes still on the ground where she'd thrown it out the window. When she gets back inside, she lights a candle and goes to check out the window where she'd last seen the light from Teresa's match. The window is now closed, but Irene still finds the marks on the wood where Teresa had pried it open. Then she also finds a spot on the floor that looks like it had just been scrubbed, the floor still wet. Irene is now truly freaked out, and she rushes to Madame Fourneau's room. The next morning, Madame Fourneau is having a meeting with Irene, Mademoiselle Dupré, and the groundskeeper in her office. The groundskeeper is telling her that it would be impossible for anyone to scale the outer wall without a ladder, and the only place where someone could climb over would be the front gate. Irene insists that Teresa never made it anywhere near the front gate since she'd been waiting there the whole night. After the others leave, Irene stays behind to confront Madame Fourneau more directly. She insists that Teresa never left the building, and repeats the strange things she'd seen, like the light at the window, the marks on the windowsill, and the scrubbed floor. She also points out that now with Teresa's disappearance, there have been 5 girls who have disappeared from the school in less than 4 months. She says that since she's in charge of correspondence at the school, she would be the first to know if any of the families had written to tell them that their daughters had returned home. But they have not heard from any of the families. Irene threatens to leave herself since Madame Fourneau seems to refuse to do anything about the missing girls. She even threatens to tell the world about the cruel and unusual teaching methods that Madame Fourneau uses. This finally pisses off the headmistress, who takes away Irene's keys, effectively demoting her from being her second in command. However, we do see that Irene is still exerting some influence over Madame Fourneau. In a dictation class, the headmistress pauses when she notices that Catalina is once again not paying attention in class. But when she goes to chastise the girl, she is stopped short by an intense glare from Irene. Later, we see Irene surreptitiously test a window in the bakery, which has not been nailed down and opens silently. She meets with one of her underlings who tells her that all of her things are packed, and Irene instructs her to burn all of the drawings in their secret boudoir. Evidently, they've been making a lot of preparations for her to escape. And I do believe that if anyone can do it successfully, it would be Irene. She goes through the rest of her day, with Madame Fourneau still appearing deeply affected by her staring at her in needlework class. During dinner, we see Irene staring at Teresa's chair with a look of loss and perhaps even a twinge of guilt. I know I've said it a couple times now, but Mary Maud's performance in this movie is absolutely incredible. She does a great job of believably transforming this character from a terrifying and hateable antagonist to an almost relatable protagonist, a very difficult thing to do. That night, after the girls have said their prayers and Mademoiselle Dupré has turned out the lights, Madame Fourneau asks her to have Irene come to her office. From the way her voice quavers with emotion, we can guess that she's been feeling a deep sense of regret from their confrontation earlier, and perhaps she's even ready to admit that Irene was right and they have a much more serious problem on their hands than she was willing to admit before. Irene, of course, was planning on making her great escape that very night, so she goes ahead and gets fully dressed before going downstairs. She decides to make her escape right then instead of going into Madame Fourneau's office, but when a door she thought had no key turns out to be locked, she begins panicking. The headmistress calls out to Irene when she hears her trying to open the front door, and Irene runs back upstairs. This leads into a tense pseudo-chase scene as Irene tries to escape from Madame Fourneau, who she evidently has begun thinking might be behind these missing girls. Their chase scene leads all the way up to a disused room in the school's attic. I had to finish filming on a different day. Sorry for the lighting change. The camera's perspective shifts to that of Madame Fourneau as she sees Irene slumped against a wall in the attic. She goes to the girl thinking she's merely unconscious until she notices all of the blood matted against the side of her head. And just like that, the second protagonist of the movie has been killed off. More disturbingly, Madame Fourneau notices that Irene's hands have been chopped off. She hears someone moving nearby and gets up to look in a small room off to the side. And who should she find inside but her son, Louis. Louis smiles at her and begins revealing to us what he's been working on for the past 4 months.
Only the hands were missing. Irene had the same hands as yours. Slim, but strong.
He pulls back the sheet on the table to reveal the rotting remains of his Frankensteined together dead girl, stitched together from different body parts he's collected from the 6 girls he's murdered, all to create a girl just like his mother. He tells his mom to talk to the girl to teach her how to take care of him properly, and then he locks his mother in the room with his grisly creation. The movie ends on a freeze frame of Louis smiling to himself outside the room while we hear his mother's screams from inside. Wow, I'm honestly a little lost as to what I should say right now. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that usually I cover, well, bad movies. And this certainly was not a bad movie. It might be a little bit dated in plot structure, certainly by today's standards, but it was well written, well acted, well directed, beautifully shot, and has a very strong anti-fascist message to it. For as powerful as Madame Fourneau was, her iron grip over the school still wasn't powerful enough to maintain complete control. Girls like Irene and her friends found ways to ingratiate themselves in the system, allowing them to build their own subsystem of power, where they could wield their authority over the other girls to both scare them into submission or to offer gifts like the meetings with Henry, or overlook other infractions in return for other favors. It's also fascinating to examine all the ways that Madame Fourneau's own internalized homophobia manifested and projected itself on the other girls, with the intense effects of their sexual repression evidenced in scenes like when Susanna meets with the woodcutter during the needlework class, or how Irene built built an entire homoerotic subculture quite literally underneath Madame Fourneau's office. Of course, I'd be remiss in overlooking Louis's character, as he is perhaps the most repressed, without access to any of the sexual outlets that the girls have developed. As a result, he has become the most twisted and monstrous of Madame Fourneau's victims, exercising his power in a very Norman Bates-esque manner due to his mother's totalitarian overparenting. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this important cult classic. It was definitely a lot of fun for me to watch this movie, which influenced so many of my other favorite movies. At the very least, I hope you'll try and go out and watch this movie yourself, because at the end of the day, this entire channel is dedicated to showing people lesser known movies that I think they should watch, whether it be in a so bad it's good kind of way, or in a genuinely artistic and thought-provoking way like with this movie. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I honestly can't express how much I love reading all of your comments, and I've even learned some pretty interesting behind-the-scenes facts from some of you equally dedicated movie fans, so keep them coming. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And, as always, stay weird.